Hello everyone, and welcome to this new video tutorial for Maverick Render. In this tutorial, we will introduce the animation options in Maverick focused on objects. You will notice some UI changes compared to previous versions, which we will discuss as we go. When you open Maverick, you will see the timeline at the bottom, but we recommend selecting the animation layout if you plan to animate. This will give you more workspace. The first significant UI change is that we've unified all scene objects into a single panel. Lights, cameras, and objects are now in the same place. To start animating, we need to go to the toolbar and create a transform motion controller. With this new node, you can easily animate translation, rotation, and scaling options. Now, simply drop it onto whatever you want to animate, in this case our teapot. As soon as you create the motion controller, you will see it in the animation panel. Its functionality is straightforward. For every parameter, you'll have an initial value and a final value, and the animation transitions from one to the other. The workflow would be to go to a frame near the end of the timeline and configure the final value of the parameter by moving its slider. Now, simply scrub through the timeline to see the resulting animation. In this case, we see the teapot moving along the Z-axis. Next, let's configure a movement along the X-axis by setting an initial and a final value. Along with translation animation, you can easily add rotation and scaling animations. By scrubbing, you can check the result whenever needed. Now we have translation, rotation, and scaling animation in the same motion controller. From the context menu, you can delete the motion controller to start over. Let's create a new motion controller and drop it onto the teapot. Now we configure a movement along the X-axis. Once we're done, we create another motion controller and drop it onto the teapot again. This time, let's configure a rotation along the Z-axis for 2 full turns. We can now see the combination of the two movements by scrubbing. If we change the order of the motion controllers in the timeline, we see that the result changes, so be careful with that. Let's take a look at how the timeline works. Obviously, you can move the motion controllers and place them wherever you like, and the movement will begin when the timeline reaches each motion controller. You can also lengthen or shorten their duration easily. It's essential to set the initial and final frames. In this case, we'll set the final frame to 61. You can press play to view the animation. If your scene is heavy, play might not run at real-time speed, so in that case, you'll need to launch a preview animation. Press the button, and once it's done, an MP4 video will be generated in your snapshots folder. If you open it, you'll see the animation result. Now let's delete the motion controllers we've created since we're going to explore more options. Let's create a target object and move it away from the teapot. We want the teapot to rotate around this target. To do this, we create a motion controller and drop it onto the teapot. We configure the Z-axis rotation to 360 degrees and see how the teapot rotates around itself. In the coordinates rollup, we activate the pivot option and select the target. If we scrub now, we'll see the teapot rotating with the target as its center or pivot. Let's delete the motion controller and the target and explore another way to do the same thing. We create an assembly and activate its gizmo visualization. We move it and separate it from the teapot. Now we drop the teapot inside this assembly. We create a motion controller and drop it onto the assembly. We go to a frame near the end of the timeline and configure the final rotation. Now we have the rotation around the desired point. Next, we can create another motion controller, but this time we'll drop it onto the teapot. We configure it to perform 3 full rotations. And we can see the animation result in the timeline. Now the teapot rotates around the assembly while also rotating on its own axis. Let's explore other options for motion controllers. We create a new one and configure a movement along the x-axis. In the easing options, we see it's set to linear mode, so the movement is continuous throughout the animation. There are several types of easing you can try. Ease in and ease out make movements slower at the beginning and end. You can configure your custom easing with the custom profile. Here you have a small graph, and you can, for example, make the movement very fast at the start and slow at the end. Experiment with the available options to learn how they work. Using Control-Click, you can add new points to the graph. In the context menu, you'll find some interesting presets with predefined graphs. Play around with them to see the results. Other interesting options are repeat and ping pong to create different movements. Finally, in this introduction, let's learn how to render the resulting animation. In the Render panel, you'll see a new tab called Timeline. The first thing to consider is that if you change the resolution and want to see it in the IPR, you'll need to adjust it in the Globals combo box. Now, just configure the render parameters. As a general rule, you can use denoiser and a sampling level between 7 and 9. Set the output path and, in the timeline, select the Full Animation Timeline option. Let's render it in draft mode to see it. Here's the video in just a few seconds. That's all for now. See you in future videos where we'll put what we've learned here into practice. Have fun with Maverick, and see you in the next video.